The Bible tells us in vivid and sometimes painful detail how Jesus of Nazareth died. We know where he was crucified, who stood near him, what he said with his final breath, and how his body was taken down. But when it comes to his mother, the woman who carried him, raised him, followed his ministry, and stood beneath the cross as he was executed, the Bible suddenly falls silent. No description, no final scene, no account of her last days, just an abrupt and unsettling absence. That silence is not small. It is one of the most striking gaps in all of Christian scripture. Mary is not a background character. She is present at the very beginning of the story, chosen for a role no other human being has ever held. She is there at Jesus' first miracle, and she is there at his death. After the resurrection, she appears one final time among the early believers, and then she disappears from the written record entirely. No mention of her death, no grave, no farewell words. For a figure so central to Christianity, the silence is almost deafening. So the question naturally arises, why isn't Mary's death recorded? Did the authors of the Bible simply not know what happened to her? Was her death considered unimportant compared to the story of Jesus? Or did early Christians know something extraordinary about her final days? Something so sacred, so mysterious that it was never written down? This question has lingered for nearly 2,000 years. From the earliest centuries of Christianity, believers have wrestled with what happened to Mary at the end of her life. Some traditions claim she died peacefully, surrounded by the apostles in what later came to be called her falling asleep. Others insist she never experienced death at all, but was taken directly into heaven, body and soul. And still others argue that the truth was preserved through oral tradition, deliberately kept outside of Scripture. What makes this mystery even more compelling is that the Bible is not silent by accident. The Gospels and early Christian writings were carefully shaped documents written for specific communities under specific pressures and with clear intentions. Every inclusion and every omission mattered, which means the absence of Mary's death raises a deeper issue, not just about history, but about meaning. What did early Christians believe about Mary, and why might they have chosen not to write her ending down? This question still matters today, because Mary remains one of the most influential figures in human history. She is honored across cultures, denominations, and centuries. For millions, she represents obedience, suffering, faith, and hope. Understanding how her life may have ended isn't just about curiosity. It's about understanding how belief is formed, how traditions survive, and why some mysteries endure. In asking how the Virgin Mary died, we are really asking a bigger question. Where does history end, and where does faith begin? And why has that boundary remained so carefully guarded for so long? To understand why the mystery of Mary's death exists at all, we first have to confront what the Bible actually says, and more importantly, what it does not say. Many people assume that because Mary is so central to Christian belief, Scripture must clearly record the end of her life. But when the texts are examined closely, a surprising reality emerges. The Bible never describes Mary's death, burial, or final years in any detail. Mary appears prominently in the opening chapters of the Gospels. She is present at the Annunciation, at the birth of Jesus, and throughout his early life. Later, she appears briefly during his public ministry, and most powerfully at the crucifixion, where she watches her son die. After that moment, Mary fades into the background of the narrative. The last explicit reference to her in the New Testament comes in the book of Acts, where she is mentioned among the believers gathered in prayer after Jesus' ascension. And then, nothing. There is no verse describing her aging, no mention of illness, no record of persecution, and no account of her passing. This absence is especially striking because the Bible does record the deaths of other important figures. The martyrdom of Stephen is described in detail. The death of James is noted. Even the execution of John the Baptist is narrated at length. Yet Mary, arguably the most honored woman in Christian history, is given no ending at all. One reason for this silence lies in the purpose of the biblical texts themselves. The Gospels were not written as complete biographies of every major figure. They were testimonies centered on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Everything else served that core message. Once Mary's role in that story was fulfilled, once Jesus' mission had been completed, the writers may have seen little reason to continue her narrative. Historical context also plays a role. The New Testament was written decades after Jesus' death. During a time of persecution and instability, early Christian communities were focused on survival, teaching, and preserving the message of salvation. Details that did not directly support that mission may have been left out, even if they were known. But the silence may also be intentional in a deeper sense. Early Christianity relied heavily on oral tradition. Stories were passed down through memory long before they were written. It is entirely possible that Mary's final days were known within these communities, but were never recorded, either out of reverence or caution. Writing about her death could have invited controversy or misunderstanding at a time when Christian belief was still forming. What the Bible gives us then is not an answer, but a boundary. It defines Mary's role without defining her ending, and in that space between what is written and what is remembered, the mystery begins. When the Bible falls silent, early Christian belief does not. In the centuries immediately following the death of Jesus, communities of believers spread rapidly across the Roman world, carrying with them stories, memories, and teachings that were not yet written down. This period, before a fixed biblical canon existed, was shaped by oral tradition, and within that living memory, the question of Mary's final days did not disappear. It quietly grew. Early Christians did not experience faith primarily through books. Most were illiterate, and Scripture itself was rare and costly. Belief was passed from person to person, elder to student, family to family. Stories were told in gatherings, repeated in prayers, and preserved through ritual. In this environment, what mattered was not only what was written, but what was remembered. Mary's life, because of her closeness to Jesus, carried deep emotional and spiritual weight, and it is difficult to imagine that her death went unnoticed or unspoken. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians were already reflecting on how Mary's life may have ended. Unlike many early believers who suffered violent persecution, Mary was remembered as someone whose end was peaceful. There is no early tradition of her martyrdom, no accounts of imprisonment or execution. Instead, she was believed to have completed her life quietly, sustained by faith, surrounded by the community that had grown out of her son's teachings. As Christianity expanded geographically, local traditions formed around Mary's later years. Some communities believed she remained in Jerusalem, close to the heart of the early church. Others claimed she lived in Ephesus under the care of the Apostle John, whom Jesus entrusted with her protection while dying on the cross. These traditions were more than speculation. They were attempts to root memory in place, to preserve closeness to a sacred figure through geography and story. By the 4th century, church leaders and theologians began addressing Mary's end more openly. Thinkers such as Augustine of Hippo acknowledged that Scripture offered no direct account of her death, yet spoke of her with profound reverence. The lack of detail was not treated as a failure of Scripture, but as a sign of Mary's unique role. set apart, yet fully human. Around the same time, written narratives began to appear describing Mary's final moments. These texts, though written later, drew from much older oral traditions. They speak of Mary being visited by the apostles, of her calm acceptance of death, and of a divine presence surrounding her passing. While these writings were not included in the Bible, they spread widely and deeply influenced Christian imagination. What matters most is not whether every detail of these stories can be historically verified, but what they reveal about belief. Across regions and generations, there is a consistent conviction that Mary's end was not marked by fear or suffering. Her death was seen as dignified, peaceful, and filled with hope, a reflection of the life she had lived. By the 6th and 7th centuries, this belief became especially prominent in Eastern Christianity. The idea that Mary fell asleep rather than endured death as punishment took firm hold. Writers like John of Damascus described her passing as a transition rather than a conclusion, emphasizing peace over pain and continuity over loss. Yet, even with these shared beliefs, disagreement remained. Some Christians insisted Mary must have died like all other humans. Others believed her closeness to God meant her end was fundamentally different. What united them was not certainty, but reverence. Mary's final days were treated as sacred territory, approached carefully and spoken of with restraint. This diversity explains why no single account dominated early Christianity. Instead, a shared intuition endured. Whatever happened, it was extraordinary. Mary's end belonged not just to history, but to mystery, and from these early beliefs, the later doctrines of Dormition and Assumption would eventually emerge. By the time Christianity had spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, a powerful and emotionally rich belief had taken shape regarding Mary's final days. This belief came to be known as the Dormition, a word meaning falling asleep. The language itself reveals how early Christians understood her death. Mary was not remembered as someone overtaken by fear or suffering, but as someone who gently passed from this life into the presence of God, as one drifts into peaceful rest. According to this tradition, Mary became aware that her earthly life was nearing its end. This awareness did not bring panic or resistance. Instead, it was met with the same quiet trust that had defined her life from the beginning. Just as she had accepted her calling with humility, she now prepared herself for death through prayer and reflection. For early Christians, this detail was essential. It presented Mary not only as the mother of Jesus, but as the ideal believer, someone whose faith remained steady even at life's final threshold. One of the most enduring elements of the Dormition tradition is the gathering of the apostles. The story holds that they were brought together from distant regions to be present with Mary in her final moments. Whether understood literally or symbolically, this gathering carries deep meaning. The community formed through her Son now surrounded her, uniting the beginning of the Christian story with its continuation. Mary was not alone. She was held by the very faith she had helped bring into the world. Mary's death, as described in these accounts, is quiet and unforced. There is no struggle, no desperation, no fear. She entrusts her life back to God willingly, surrounded by prayer and peace. This portrayal sharply contrasts with how death was commonly understood in the ancient world, where it was often associated with punishment, chaos, or divine judgment. In Mary's case, death is transformed into completion rather than loss. The emphasis on peace is central to the Dormition tradition. Her body is treated with reverence, not anxiety. Mourning exists, but it is not consumed by despair. Early Christians believed that Mary's unique relationship with God meant she would not be abandoned in death. Her body and soul remained under divine care, protected and honored rather than forgotten. This belief reflected more than emotional comfort. It expressed a profound theological conviction. Mary was the one who carried life itself within her. In Christian understanding, death entered the world through disobedience, but Mary's obedience represented its reversal. Her peaceful death became a sign of hope, suggesting that death no longer held absolute power. In Eastern Christian worship, the Dormition became a major feast, celebrated through prayer, hymns, and storytelling. These practices reinforced the belief that Mary's death was not tragic, but sacred. Worshippers were invited to see in her story a promise for themselves, that faithfulness could transform death into rest rather than terror. What makes the Dormition especially powerful is its balance. Mary is honored but not removed from human experience. She does die. She does leave the world. This preserved her humanity while still affirming her special role. Her death was extraordinary not because it denied reality, but because it revealed what reality could become when shaped by faith. As the tradition developed, variations emerged. Some accounts focused on heavenly signs at the moment of her passing. Others emphasized the grief of those who loved her, or the holiness of her resting place. Yet beneath these variations, the message remained consistent. Mary's end was marked by trust, dignity, and divine closeness. The Dormition also served a deeply pastoral purpose. In a world where death was common and often brutal, Mary's story offered reassurance. If the mother of Jesus could face death without fear, then death itself could be reimagined. It was no longer only an enemy, but a doorway. Through Mary's Dormition, believers were encouraged to see death not as abandonment by God, but as a return to Him. Her story reframed mortality itself, offering hope that the end of life was not the end of meaning. What is most striking is what the Dormition does not attempt to do. It does not explain everything. It avoids spectacle. It leaves room for mystery. Instead of focusing on what could be seen, it focuses on what could be trusted. By describing Mary's death as sleep, early Christians expressed their belief that death had been transformed by resurrection. Sleep implies waking. Rest implies renewal. In this way, Mary's Dormition became a reflection of the destiny believers hoped for themselves. This belief endured for centuries, shaping worship, theology, and imagination. Even as later traditions debated whether Mary truly died or was taken directly into heaven, the Dormition remained foundational. It preserved the image of Mary as fully human, fully faithful, and fully at peace. To understand the Dormition is to understand how early Christians learned to face death itself. In Mary's final moments, they saw not an ending, but a fulfillment. Her life began with a yes to God, and according to this tradition, it ended the same way, in trust, in peace, and in hope. While the Dormition presents Mary's death as peaceful and human, another tradition asks a far more unsettling question. What if Mary never truly died at all? What if her story did not end with sleep, burial, or rest, but with departure? This question gave rise to one of the most distinctive and debated beliefs in Christian history, the Assumption. The Assumption holds that Mary was taken into heaven, body and soul. Unlike ordinary believers whose bodies remain on earth, Mary's entire being was believed to have been drawn into God's presence. The belief does not begin by denying death outright. Instead, it begins by questioning whether death, as separation and decay, could apply to someone so closely bound to the source of life itself. For centuries, this idea circulated quietly alongside the Dormition. Some believers imagined Mary dying first, then being taken up. Others believed death was bypassed entirely. What united these views was not precision, but intuition. Mary's end was different. Her story did not fit neatly into ordinary categories. The roots of the assumption lie not in a single text, but in a pattern of belief. Early Christians noticed something unusual. There was no grave universally venerated as Mary's. Martyrs' tombs became centers of devotion. Apostles' burial places were fiercely protected, but Mary's body, unlike theirs, was never clearly located. For many believers, absence suggested presence elsewhere. This absence became the soil from which belief grew. If Mary's body had not remained on earth, where else could it be? And if Christ's resurrection transformed death itself, could that transformation have applied uniquely to the woman who bore him? The assumption also reflects a broader theological instinct. Christianity teaches that death entered the world through sin. Mary, understood as uniquely obedient and faithful, came to symbolize the undoing of that rupture. Her assumption was seen not as an exception but as a preview, an image of what humanity restored might look like. Importantly, the assumption was not framed as spectacle. Early reflections avoided dramatic imagery. The focus was not on how Mary was taken, but on what her taking meant. Her destiny pointed forward, not upward. It suggested that human existence did not end in decay, but in transformation. As centuries passed, the assumption gained momentum, particularly in Western Christianity. Sermons, prayers, and hymns increasingly spoke of Mary's glorification. Art began to depict her rising, not in struggle but in surrender. The visual language mirrored the theology. Upward motion without resistance, elevation without force. Yet disagreement remained. Some theologians insisted Mary must have died, arguing that death was part of being human, and Mary's humanity must be preserved. Others believed her exemption from death only deepened her humanity by revealing its ultimate purpose. The debate was never settled by evidence. It was shaped by meaning. This tension endured for centuries. The Church did not rush to define the assumption as doctrine. Instead, it allowed the belief to mature slowly, tested by time, prayer, and reflection. Only in the 20th century was it formally declared, when Pius XII proclaimed that Mary was assumed into heaven at the end of her earthly life. Notably, the declaration was careful. It did not define whether Mary died or not. The language was deliberate, leaving room for both understandings. This restraint reveals something essential. The assumption was never meant to eliminate mystery. It was meant to protect it. What matters is not the mechanism, but the meaning. The assumption speaks to the hope that death does not have the final word. It affirms that the human body is not disposable, not temporary, not forgotten. In Mary's assumption, believers saw the promise that the whole person matters. Critics have often argued that the assumption lacks historical grounding. There is no eyewitness account, no dated record, no physical evidence. But believers respond that the assumption was never about proof. It was about coherence. It fit the pattern of belief already present: resurrection, transformation, restoration. The assumption also reframed Mary's role. She was no longer only the beginning of Jesus' life on earth, but a sign of humanity's destiny beyond it. Her story formed a bridge between incarnation and resurrection, between birth and fulfillment. Emotionally, the assumption offered comfort. If Mary was taken whole into God's presence, then death was not erasure. Separation was not permanent. Loss was not final. The belief spoke to grief, not by denying it, but by placing it within a larger horizon. Theologically, the assumption reinforced the idea that salvation was not escape from the body, but redemption of it. Mary's assumption became a statement about embodiment itself. Flesh mattered, history mattered, human life mattered all the way to the end. When belief moves beyond Scripture, history becomes complicated. By the time Christians began seriously asking what happened to Mary after her final days, they were no longer dealing only with memory, but with interpretation. This is where historians step in, and where certainty begins to unravel. The first challenge is simple but decisive. There is no contemporary historical record of Mary's death. No Roman document mentions it. No early Christian chronicle dates it. No universally accepted burial site was ever confirmed. For historians trained to rely on documents, inscriptions, and physical evidence, this absence creates a problem. It means Mary's end cannot be reconstructed, the way other ancient lives sometimes can. Yet the absence of evidence does not equal absence of belief. Beginning around the 3rd and 4th centuries, written texts start to appear that attempt to preserve traditions about Mary's final days. These writings are known as apocryphal texts, religious writings that were read and respected by many Christians but never included in the biblical canon. Among the most influential of these are texts often grouped under the title Transitus Mariae, or The Passing of Mary. These writings describe Mary's final moments, the gathering of the apostles, her peaceful death, and, in some versions, her bodily glorification. Scholars agree these texts were written centuries after Mary's lifetime, but they also agree they likely drew from much older oral traditions. This creates a tension historians must navigate carefully. On one hand, the texts are not eyewitness accounts and cannot be treated as straightforward history. On the other, they reveal what large numbers of Christians believed long before official doctrines were declared. They are not neutral documents, they are windows into faith, memory, and communal identity. Some scholars argue that these stories emerged as theological reflections rather than historical recollections. As devotion to Mary grew, communities may have shaped narratives that expressed what they believed should have happened to her, rather than what could be proven. From this perspective, the Dormition and Assumption are seen less as reports and more as symbolic truths. Others push back against this reduction. They point out that early Christianity preserved many traditions accurately through oral transmission, especially within close-knit communities. They argue that just because a tradition was written down later does not mean it was invented later. In ancient cultures, memory often preceded text. Archaeology adds another layer of debate. Sites in Jerusalem and Ephesus have both been associated with Mary's final years. Pilgrims visited these places early on, believing they were connected to her life. Yet none of these locations produced definitive evidence of her death or burial. Once again, the historical trail fades precisely where the mystery intensifies. Modern historians remain divided. Some conclude that Mary likely died a normal human death, unnoticed by historians because she held no political power. Others argue that the complete absence of a burial tradition is itself unusual and demands explanation. The disagreement is not over facts alone, but over how silence should be interpreted. What makes this debate unique is that it can't be resolved by new discoveries. No lost document is expected to surface. No grave is likely to be identified conclusively. The question of Mary's death exists in a space where history reaches its limit. This is why the debate persists. It is not simply about what happened, but about how truth is defined. Is truth limited to what can be documented, or can truth also exist in shared belief, ritual, and meaning? For believers, the apocryphal texts are valuable not because they prove something, but because they preserve how early Christians understood holiness, death, and hope. For historians, those same texts must be approached with caution, precisely because belief and memory are intertwined. In the end, history does not give us an answer, it gives us a boundary. Beyond that boundary lies theology, tradition, and faith. The mystery of Mary's death survives because it lives exactly at that intersection. And perhaps that is why it has endured, not because it can be solved, but because it continues to ask something deeper. How much of the past can we truly recover, and how much do we inherit through trust? Mary's story does not end with evidence. It ends with interpretation, and that, more than any missing document, explains why the question of her death remains open. At this point, it may seem reasonable to ask why this mystery still matters at all. After centuries of debate with no definitive historical answer, why does the question of Mary's death continue to draw attention? The reason is simple. This mystery speaks to concerns that are still deeply human. It touches fear, hope, loss, and the desire to believe that death does not erase meaning. Mary's story endures because it sits at the crossroads of faith and mortality. Unlike kings, warriors, or martyrs, Mary represents ordinary human vulnerability, elevated by trust. She did not seek power or recognition. She lived a life shaped by obedience, uncertainty, and quiet endurance. How her life ended becomes important because it reflects how such a life is valued. If Mary's end was peaceful, honored, or transformed, then suffering and faith are not forgotten. They are remembered. In a modern world that often treats death as something to avoid or hide, the mystery of Mary's passing offers a different lens. It does not promise easy answers. It does not deny grief. Instead, it suggests that the end of life can hold meaning beyond loss. Whether one accepts the Dormition, the Assumption, or a simple human death, the core message remains the same. Death is not the final measure of a life's worth. This mystery also matters because it reveals how belief is formed. Mary's story shows that faith is not built only on documents and dates, but on memory, trust, and shared meaning. Communities carried her story forward not because they had proof, but because it shaped how they understood hope. In a time when certainty is often demanded, the endurance of this mystery reminds us that not everything meaningful can be resolved. For believers, Mary's unresolved ending becomes a source of comfort. It allows space for hope without forcing conclusions. For skeptics, it offers a window into how humans respond to uncertainty by telling stories that preserve dignity and purpose. In both cases, the mystery functions not as a problem, but as an invitation. Ultimately, the question of how Mary died matters because it reflects a larger question each generation must face. What do we believe happens at the end of life, and why? Mary's story does not answer that question directly. Instead, it keeps it alive. And perhaps that is its greatest power. The mystery remains not because it failed to be solved, but because it continues to speak, to fear, to faith, and to the hope that the end of life is not the end of meaning. After centuries of reflection, debate, prayer, and storytelling, we arrive at a conclusion that may feel unexpected. We do not know with certainty how Mary died, and yet we somehow know enough. The silence in the Bible was never filled by accident. It was filled by meaning. Across generations, Christians did not preserve Mary's story because they possessed definitive proof, but because her life demanded remembrance. Whether she died peacefully, fell asleep in faith, or was taken into heaven, every tradition points in the same direction. Her end was not marked by fear, abandonment, or obscurity. It was marked by trust. Mary's legacy does not depend on the details of her final moments. It rests on the way she lived and on what her life came to represent. She stands as a figure who said yes when the future was uncertain, who endured suffering without bitterness, and who remained faithful even when the promise she believed in led her to the foot of a cross. How such a life ends matters, but perhaps not in the way we usually expect. History asks for evidence. Faith asks for meaning. In Mary's case, the two never fully merge, and that tension is precisely why her story has endured. The mystery of her death reminds us that some truths are carried, not proven, remembered, not recorded, protected, not explained. In a world that often demands certainty, Mary's hidden ending offers something different. It offers permission to hope without complete answers, to trust without full clarity, to believe that a life shaped by love and obedience is not erased by death, but fulfilled beyond it. So maybe the real question is not how Mary died, but why her story still lives, why her name is still spoken, why her life continues to inspire reflection, comfort, and wonder across centuries. Her ending was never meant to close the story. It was meant to open it. If this exploration gave you a new perspective, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to explore more mysteries where history and belief intersect, stay with us. There's much more to uncover.